Beneath the soil of ancient cities lie secrets of earth-shattering disasters. These forgotten cataclysms did more than just destroy. They forged the very foundations of our world, redirecting the entire course of human history. By the end of this journey, you will see the rise and fall of ancient civilizations through an entirely new lens. Why did mighty empires like the Acadians vanish almost overnight, and what hidden force preserved Egypt for millennia when others fell? We will uncover how volcanic eruptions, colossal floods, and sudden climate shifts sculpted the birthplaces of civilization in Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, revealing patterns of resilience and collapse that still echo in our societies today. What does it truly mean for a society to be strong? A tranquil river valley, lush with crops and dotted with villages, could be utterly transformed in a single day. The river, a life-giver for generations, swells into a monstrous force, swallowing fields and homes in a churning, muddy roar. This is the raw power of a cataclysm, a sudden and violent natural event that reshapes the world. For our earliest civilizations, these were not just bad storms or unfortunate seasons. They were earthquakes that shattered cities, volcanic eruptions that choked the skies with ash, and decades-long droughts that turned fertile plains to dust. Historians point out that these events were pivotal turning points, forcing human societies to adapt or face oblivion. A single massive volcanic eruption, for example, could spew so much ash and sulfur into the atmosphere that it would block out the sun for years. Summers would vanish, replaced by a perpetual, freezing twilight. Crops would fail completely, leading to famine, mass migration, and the collapse of entire social orders. Understanding these forces is crucial. It moves us beyond seeing ancient history as a simple timeline of kings and conquests. Instead, we begin to see a dramatic struggle for survival, where the very ground beneath their feet and the climate above their heads could become their greatest enemy. This foundational knowledge allows us to truly appreciate the fragility of these early societies, and more importantly, their incredible resilience in the face of existential threats. With this lens, we can now journey to the very heartlands of civilization, to see how these forgotten cataclysms literally rewrote the map of human history. The stage for these earth-shattering events was set over thousands of years by the slow, relentless grind of tectonic plates. This geological time frame, stretching from the Neolithic Revolution around 10,000 years before the Common Era to the Bronze Age collapse around 1,200 years before the Common Era, represents a uniquely fragile window in human history. It was a period when our earliest civilizations were taking their first tentative steps, yet the very planet beneath them was in a state of dramatic flux. Ice ages were retreating, sea levels were rising, and the global climate was anything but stable. This was not a smooth, gentle transition. Experts like Brian Fagan describe a world punctuated by abrupt, violent shifts. One of the most devastating was the 4.2 Kiloyear Event, a mega drought so severe it triggered collapses from Egypt to the Indus Valley. Imagine a society just learning to rely on agriculture, its population growing, its cities expanding, only to have the rains fail for generation after generation. This is the powerful intersection of human development and planetary change. By understanding this vast chronological backdrop, we can truly appreciate how a single drought, a lone volcanic eruption, or one massive flood could redirect the entire course of a civilization, forcing desperate migrations or sparking brilliant innovations. This context sets the scene for our journey into the heart of Mesopotamia, where the first great empire would be forged not just by conquest, but by fire and dust. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers could turn from life-givers into agents of pure chaos. Without warning, their waters would rise, bursting through mud brick walls and sweeping away everything in their path. This terrifying reality is embedded deep within the world's oldest stories. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods decide to wipe out humanity with a great flood, a narrative that echoes with the genuine trauma experienced by these early communities. For a long time, these were seen as mere legends, powerful myths but not history. Then archaeologists began digging. They uncovered ancient cities like and Kish, and between the layers of habitation, they found something startling: thick bands of sterile silt, clear evidence of catastrophic flooding that had buried entire settlements. This was not a one-time event. The sediment told a story of repeated deluges, a cycle of destruction etched into the very ground. Scientific analysis, including core samples taken from the Persian Gulf, confirms this. They point to a period around 5,000 years ago when massive inundations from the Persian Gulf rushed up the river valleys, swallowing the land. The myth was a memory, a cultural scar from a real, earth-shattering disaster. This recurring threat forced a revolution in human organization. How do you protect a city from a force of nature? The answer was to build not just for the present, but for the next inevitable flood. The Mesopotamians became masters of water, engineering the world's first large-scale irrigation networks to channel water to their fields during dry seasons, and constructing immense levees and dams to hold back the raging rivers during the wet ones. This was the birth of centralized government. It took a powerful, organized authority to plan these projects, to command the labor of thousands, and to manage the distribution of water resources. Catastrophe forged bureaucracy. The flood that could destroy a village became the very reason a city-state could grow stronger, its people more united and its technology more advanced. This is the ultimate paradox of these cataclysms. They were both destroyers and catalysts. They shattered old worlds, but from the mud and silt, they forced the creation of new, more resilient ones. This delicate dance with water makes you wonder, what happens when the opposite force takes hold, when the life-giving rains simply vanish for generations? But the story of water is not only one of violent floods. It is also a tale of slow, quiet disappearance. In the Indus Valley, a civilization known for its meticulously planned cities and sophisticated drainage systems faced a far more insidious enemy than a raging river. Its lifeblood simply began to drift away. Mohenjo-Daro, once a bustling metropolis of orderly streets and public baths, was not buried in a single cataclysm. Instead, it was slowly strangled by thirst. The great Indus River and its sister, the Gaga Hakra, began to shift their courses. This was not a sudden event, but a creeping disaster driven by the slow grind of tectonic plates and major shifts in global climate patterns around 1900 years before the Common Era. The rivers that had nourished fields and filled the city's wells for centuries were gradually moving, leaving the land to bake and the people to wonder where the water had gone. Archaeologists digging at these sites find no layers of destruction from invading armies. Instead, they find wells dug deeper and deeper, a desperate search for a vanishing resource until finally the digging stopped. The great urban centers, dependent on a constant, reliable water supply for their dense populations, could no longer function. What happens to a city when its fundamental reason for existing simply evaporates? The answer is not a dramatic explosion, but a slow, painful exodus. People did not die in the streets. They simply packed their lives and left, migrating to smaller villages or following the rivers to new lands. As expert Gregory Possehl suggests, this was less a collapse and more a profound adaptation. The grand, centralized urban experiment gave way to a dispersed, rural way of life. The cataclysm here was not a bang, but a long, drawn-out whisper. It demonstrates that a civilization's greatest threat may not be a single violent shock, but the slow, relentless erosion of its most basic needs. The struggle of the Indus Valley echoes into our own time, where water tables are falling and rivers are stressed, reminding us that the stability of our environment is the most precious resource we have. If a river's slow retreat can dismantle a great civilization, what then can be wrought by the sudden, violent shudder of the earth itself? The ground itself could turn against the cities built upon it. In ancient Anatolia, the very stones that formed the walls of mighty citadels like Troy could become instruments of their own destruction in a matter of minutes. A deep, subterranean shudder would ripple upwards, shaking the foundations of palaces and homes until they collapsed into clouds of dust and rubble, burying entire streets and their inhabitants. This region was a vibrant crossroads of early cultures, but its geological position made it a tinderbox of tectonic activity, sitting directly atop a web of active fault lines. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, a period of intense seismic instability contributed to the widespread chaos of the late Bronze Age collapse. The destruction was not merely physical. When a major trade hub was shattered by an earthquake, the economic and political shockwaves traveled for hundreds of miles. The Hittite Empire, a contemporary superpower, left behind clay tablets that speak of this terror in stark terms, recording events where the land itself shook, undermining their authority and crippling their capacity to command distant territories. Modern geologists see the proof etched into the landscape itself, identifying ancient fault scars on the Earth's surface, while archaeologists uncover the grim evidence within excavation layers, buildings crushed as if by a giant's hand. Yet from this repeated devastation emerged a profound resilience. Anatolian builders learned, through tragic trial and error, to incorporate earthquake-resistant techniques into their city planning. They used wooden beams to create flexible frames within their stone walls, a clever shock absorption system that allowed structures to sway and settle rather than shatter. Each catastrophe forced a new wave of innovation, a cycle of destruction and rebuilding that defined their civilization's character. This ancient struggle forces a difficult question upon us today. How do we balance our drive for architectural innovation with the humble necessity of preparedness in the face of inevitable natural forces? The story of the shaking Earth is a powerful one, but it pales in comparison to the global reach of a different kind of cataclysm, one that begins with a mountain exploding and can plunge the entire world into a volcanic winter. A mountain exploded in the Aegean Sea. The island of Thera, now known as Santorini, detonated with a force that defies comprehension around 1600 years before the Common Era. This was not a simple volcanic burp. It was a cataclysm that tore the island apart, sending tsunamis hundreds of feet high racing across the sea towards the sophisticated Minone civilization on Crete. Imagine a wall of water, dark and impossibly high, crashing over coastal towns and sweeping up into the very heart of their palatial centers. At the same time, a towering plume of superheated ash and rock blasted into the sky, blotting out the sun across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The world was plunged into a strange, dusty twilight. This ash fell like gray snow, a silent, suffocating blanket that smothered fields, poisoned the soil with acidic compounds, and made the very air a danger to breathe. The Minones, a people renowned for their vibrant art, sprawling palace complexes like Knossos, and a society built on maritime trade, were suddenly facing an existential threat from the sky and the sea. Their agricultural base collapsed almost overnight, their trade ships were shattered in the harbors, and their entire economic system crumbled. For decades, this event was shrouded in speculation until archaeologists like Spiridon Marinatos began to uncover the evidence. They found a distinct grayish layer of volcanic pumice and ash at Minone sites, a geological fingerprint that stretched for hundreds of miles. This scientific proof transformed a legendary disaster into a historical one. In fact, many historians see the echoes of this real event in the most famous legend of all, the story of Atlantis, a sophisticated island kingdom that sank beneath the waves in a single day and night of misfortune. The myth is a cultural memory, a way for survivors to process a trauma so vast it seemed like the wrath of the gods. The Minone world did not vanish instantly, but it was mortally wounded. The survivors faced a stark choice: adapt or perish. Many likely migrated, their knowledge and skills flowing to the rising power on the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans, who would eventually absorb what remained of Minone culture and build upon its foundations. The lesson of Thera is one of profound interconnectedness. A single geological event on one island could cripple a civilization, redirect the flow of people and ideas, and alter the cultural trajectory of an entire region. If a volcano's fire could so dramatically reshape the ancient world, what then could be accomplished by a far slower yet equally powerful force, the creeping grip of ice and global cooling? The whispers of a changing climate are etched into ancient clay. In the heart of Mesopotamia, the Acadian Empire, history's first great imperial power, did not fall to a foreign army but to an invisible, relentless enemy, Drought. Cuneiform tablets from that era do not speak of glorious battles, but of a more desperate struggle. They record the terrifying price of grain skyrocketing as harvests failed, describing scenes of social chaos and famine stalking the land. This was not a single bad year. It was a climatic catastrophe that unfolded over generations, a central chapter in the global 4.2 Kiloyear Event. The very rainfall patterns that had sustained the empire's agriculture for centuries shifted dramatically, turning once fertile fields into barren, cracked earth. Paleoclimatologists have pieced together this bleak picture from unlikely sources, analyzing ice cores from distant glaciers and sediment layers from the bottom of the ocean. These natural archives confirm a prolonged period of intense aridity that gripped the region around 2,200 years before the Common Era. The evidence is undeniable. The world itself grew drier, and the Acadian Empire, for all its military and administrative might, began to wither on the vine. The central government in the capital of Akkad found its power evaporating along with the water. Its authority was built on its ability to collect grain as taxes and redistribute it to soldiers, officials, and laborers. When the grain stopped growing, that authority dissolved. Provincial governors, once loyal, began hoarding their own dwindling supplies, and the empire fractured from within. The great cities, dependent on a centralized system of grain storage and distribution, could no longer support their populations. We see this in the archaeological record not as a layer of ash from a fire, but as a gradual thinning of artifacts followed by abandonment. People had no choice but to leave, packing what they could and adopting a nomadic lifestyle, following the herds they had once shunned. It was a brutal, forced return to a more ancient way of life. In the face of this collapse, there were flashes of brilliant adaptation. The Acadians and their successors redoubled their efforts to control the little water that remained, engineering more sophisticated and extensive irrigation canals in a desperate attempt to defy the drought. But the question remains, was this innovation enough? The empire itself was gone, a testament to the fact that technological ingenuity, while powerful, can be overwhelmed by the scale of a planetary shift. The story of the Acadians forces a sobering reflection. Our modern global civilization, with its vast interconnected networks of food and resource distribution, is in many ways the ultimate successor to these first empires. How vulnerable are we to a similar pattern of disruption? When the environmental foundation shifts, even the most sophisticated political and economic structures can tremble. This inward collapse from drought offers a stark contrast to the external pressure faced by civilizations living at the water's edge, where the very shoreline was not stable, but a frontier under constant assault by the rising sea. The sea did not merely flood the land, it erased entire worlds. While the Great Flood myths echo the sudden terror of river surges, an even more profound and relentless transformation was unfolding along the world's coastlines. As the last great ice sheets melted around 6,000 years before the Common Era, the oceans began a slow, unstoppable ascent. This was not a single event, but a creeping cataclysm that played out over centuries, swallowing vast stretches of coastal plains that had been home to human communities for generations. Where there was once fertile land connecting continents, there was now only the churn of the sea. One of the most dramatic examples lies beneath the waves of the North Sea, a lost landscape known as Doggerland. This was not a small territory, but a vast, low-lying plain that connected the British Isles to mainland Europe. It was a rich environment of hills, forests, and rivers, teeming with game and supporting a population of hunter-gatherers. As the waters rose, these people watched their homeland slowly vanish. They were forced to retreat again and again, carrying their knowledge, their languages, and their stories with them as they moved to higher ground in places like Britain and the European continent. This great migration did not happen in a vacuum. The movement of these displaced populations created ripples of interaction, potentially pushing new ideas and technologies eastward. Some scholars suggest that the cultural ferment caused by this coastal crisis may have indirectly influenced the societies emerging in the Near East, including Mesopotamia, through a long chain of diffusion and contact. The proof of these lost worlds is no longer just theoretical. Marine archaeologists, using advanced sonar and submersibles, have begun to map these submerged landscapes. They have dragged up ancient tools, the bones of mammoths, and even the remnants of campfires from the seafloor, silent testimony to a human world that now exists only beneath the waves. This ancient struggle against the rising tide showcases a different kind of resilience. It was not about building walls or digging deeper wells, but about the profound flexibility to abandon a way of life and migrate en masse. These communities had to adapt or be consumed. They shifted from relying on the rich coastal resources to developing new survival strategies, often turning more deliberately to agriculture and forming new, more complex social structures to manage life in their new territories. The parallel to our own time is inescapable. Today, we face our own era of rising seas, with island nations and coastal cities confronting the same existential threat. The story of Doggerland and the other sunken shores asks us a difficult question. What happens when the map itself begins to change and the refuge of higher ground is far away? These physical displacements, burned into the collective memory of survivors, inevitably found their expression not in history books, but in the powerful, enduring language of myth. The stories our ancestors told around flickering fires were far more than simple entertainment. They were living archives, a deep cultural memory where the raw terror of a flood or the earth-shaking fury of a volcano was woven into the very fabric of creation. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the world is born from a cosmic struggle between the god Marduk and the primordial sea goddess Tiamat, a story that echoes the constant, real-world battle against the chaotic waters of the Tigris and Euphrates. Similarly, Hindu Puranas describe cycles of creation and destruction, where the world is periodically dissolved by fire or flood, only to be reborn again. These are not random fantasies. Anthropologists like Claude Lévi-Strauss saw them as fundamental tools for the human mind. A myth provides a structure, a way to process an event so traumatic and immense that it defies ordinary explanation. It transforms chaos into a narrative, giving a society a shared story that reinforces its identity and cohesion in the aftermath of disaster. The most striking proof of this is the universal flood myth. Nearly every ancient culture has one, from the Mesopotamian story that inspired the biblical Noah to the Chinese legend of the great Yu who tamed the waters. This global resonance is not a coincidence. It points to shared, searing experiences of catastrophic deluges that were burned into the collective psyche of early agricultural societies living in vulnerable river valleys. By studying these stories, we are not just reading folklore, we are decoding ancient survival guides. They are warnings about the fragility of human endeavor and powerful lessons about the necessity of renewal. They taught people how to behave, whom to appease, and how to rebuild when the world fell apart. In many ways, our own modern media, with its endless stream of disaster films and climate change narratives, serves this exact same deep-seated need. We are still using stories to process our collective anxieties about a world that feels increasingly chaotic. This profound link between story and survival makes the next question unavoidable. If these myths are the echo, where can we find the original sound, the hard, physical proof that these earth-shaking events truly happened? The dust of millennia settles on a cracked mud brick wall, but the story it tells is one of sudden, violent chaos. Archaeologists working at sites across the ancient world have found these silent witnesses, material proof of the cataclysms we once knew only from myths. At the ancient city of Jericho, they uncovered not just one layer of destruction, but many, each a snapshot of a city shattered by earthquakes and rebuilt again and again. These are not just piles of rubble, they are carefully mapped strata, a vertical timeline where a thick band of sterile silt speaks of a devastating flood, and a layer of volcanic ash, fine and gray, points to a sky once darkened by a distant eruption. These tangible remains, from seismic cracks snaking through palace foundations to abandoned tools scattered where they were dropped in a panic, offer us a direct window into the moments that shattered early civilizations. To read this stone and soil archive, scientists use powerful techniques. Radiocarbon dating analyzes the remains of organic materials like charred seeds or animal bones, giving us a precise clock for when a disaster struck. Stratigraphy, the simple but profound study of layer upon layer of settlement, reveals the sequence of events. A city might show a century of prosperous growth, followed by a clear line of ash and collapsed walls, and then a new, different culture building on top of the ruins. This allows experts to pinpoint these catastrophes and then correlate them with the fragmentary historical records that survived. At Tel Leilan in Syria, the evidence is stark. Excavations show a thriving urban center that came to an abrupt, shocking end around 2,200 years before the Common Era. The city was simply abandoned. This date aligns perfectly with the climatic data for the Great Acadian Drought, confirming that an empire fell not to the sword, but to the slow, relentless grip of thirst. This physical evidence does more than just confirm the scale of a disaster. It reveals the human response etched into the very bones of a city. We see the shift from simple homes to heavily fortified walls, a society bracing for an uncertain future. We find mass graves, tragic and silent, that speak of a community overwhelmed. But we also find evidence of adaptation, of new irrigation channels dug in a desperate attempt to coax life from a desiccated landscape. Every collapsed wall and every resettled layer is a testament to both profound loss and stubborn resilience. With emerging technologies like ground-penetrating radar and isotope analysis, we can now peer even deeper into this past without lifting a trowel. What other forgotten events, what other stories of survival lie just beneath the surface, waiting for the right tool to reveal them? This global pattern of disaster and response finds a powerful exception in one famous river valley, where the rules of cataclysm seem to be rewritten. The Nile River did not rage, it arrived. Every year with a profound and predictable rhythm, its waters would gently swell, spilling over their banks to deposit a fresh layer of rich, black silt across the farmland of Egypt. This was not a cataclysm to be feared, but a season to be anticipated, the very heartbeat of a civilization. While Mesopotamia battled chaotic floods and the Indus Valley watched its rivers vanish, Egypt's unique geography granted it a remarkable stability. The Nile's gentle gradient and the buffering effect of its vast delta turned a potentially destructive force into a managed agricultural miracle. For centuries, this cycle of inundation, growth, and harvest allowed the Old Kingdom to flourish, its pharaohs seen as divine guarantors of this natural order. But what happens when the heartbeat of a civilization skips? Around 2,180 years before the Common Era, the rhythm broke, the annual flood began to fail. The waters that usually rose to fertilize the fields instead receded, leaving the land parched and desperate. We hear the echoes of this crisis in a desperate text known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer. The author laments that the river is blood, a poetic but terrifying image of its waters running low and stagnant, and describes a society unraveling. The wealthy are hungry, children are in tears, and the land is bowed down in misery. This was not a sudden, violent shock, but a slow, burning cataclysm of drought. The cause was not local, but global. Paleoclimatologists have traced the source of this disaster to a major shift in monsoon patterns over the Ethiopian highlands, the ultimate source of the Nile's life-giving waters. The rains simply failed year after year, and the effect downstream was catastrophic. The resulting famines shattered the political order of the Old Kingdom, ushering in the chaotic era known as the First Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation and social strife. Yet it was in this crucible of crisis that Egypt's true resilience was forged. The response was not to abandon the river, but to master it with even greater precision. The Egyptians developed increasingly sophisticated irrigation techniques, building networks of canals, basins, and sluices to capture and distribute every precious drop of the diminished flood. This engineering feat required a powerful, centralized authority to coordinate labor and resources across the entire length of the river valley. The crisis, in effect, forced the creation of a stronger, more organized state, which would rise from the chaos as the mighty Middle Kingdom. The Nile story forces us to rethink our very definition of a cataclysm. It shows that a disaster is not always a single, explosive event. Sometimes it is the terrifying absence of a relied-upon blessing. The greatest threat can be the failure of a predictable system. Egypt's longevity was not born from an absence of challenges, but from its ability to institutionalize its response to the river's whims, turning a potential agent of collapse into the very engine of its enduring power. This subtle dance with a predictable environment stands in stark contrast to the civilizations that faced a far more brutal and unpredictable force, one that arrived not with a whimper, but with the thunderous roar of collapsing mountains and the fiery breath of the earth itself. The Yellow River did not just flow, it commanded. This great, muddy serpent of water was the cradle of Chinese civilization, yet its people lived under a constant, looming threat. They called it China's sorrow, a name born from generations of watching their fields and homes vanish beneath a churning, yellow-brown deluge. Around 2,000 years before the Common Era, a period of catastrophic flooding and dramatic river course changes reshaped the early dynasties of the Xia and the Shang. The river did not just flood, it changed its very path, abandoning entire networks of canals and settlements to carve a new, destructive route across the landscape. This forced massive, desperate migrations, uprooting communities and forcing them to start anew on unfamiliar ground. The cause of this volatility was written into the land itself. The river flowed through the lowest plateau, a vast region of fine, wind-blown soil that was incredibly fertile but also terribly fragile. When communities cleared forests for agriculture, they removed the natural anchor that held this soil in place. Torrential rains would then wash unimaginable volumes of this loose earth directly into the river, clogging its channel and causing it to burst its banks with terrifying force. Historical texts and modern sediment studies tell the same story, a cycle of human action and environmental reaction that turned the river into a monster of their own making. From this recurring disaster emerged one of China's most foundational legends, the story of Yu the Great. Unlike his father, who tried to simply dam and block the waters, Yu understood that the river needed to be managed, not fought. He spent 13 years dredging new channels and directing the floodwaters safely to the sea. His success was not just an engineering triumph, it was a political one. To coordinate such a vast project required the mobilization of labor from countless villages under a single, unquestioned authority. Yu's control over the waters became the very justification for his rule, establishing the Xia dynasty and laying the blueprint for centralized state power in China. The cataclysm of the river forged the machinery of the state. It demonstrates with brutal clarity how a relentless environmental challenge can become the ultimate driver of both technological ingenuity and political consolidation. The ancient Chinese learned to read the river's moods and engineer a response, a lesson that echoes in modern debates about river management and our own relationship with the environment. If the uncontrolled power of water could forge an empire, what then is the impact of its absolute absence when the very air turns thick with dust and the land itself begins to blow away? Centuries after the Acadian Empire crumbled into dust, a similar tragedy unfolded an ocean away. The grand plazas of Tikal stood silent under a relentless sun, the stone pyramids casting long shadows over a city being consumed by the jungle. This was not the work of a foreign invader. The enemy was the sky itself. For generations, the classic Maya had thrived, building a civilization of breathtaking art, astronomy, and immense cities. But around 900 years into the Common Era, the rains began to fail. This was not a single dry season, but a prolonged drought that stretched for decades, a slow-motion cataclysm that choked the life from their world. The evidence for this disaster is locked in the mud at the bottom of ancient lakes. Scientists drilling into these sediments can read the history of the climate like the rings of a tree. The layers from this period show a dramatic increase in dust and a decrease in organic material, painting a stark picture of a landscape turning to dust. Reservoirs dried up and the intricate agricultural systems that fed millions faltered. The Maya had transformed their environment to support their great cities, clearing vast tracts of forest for agriculture. In doing so, they may have inadvertently sealed their fate. The loss of tree cover altered local rainfall patterns, and the exposed soil, baked by the sun, was picked up by the wind, creating immense dust storms that would have shrouded the cities in a ghostly haze. A society built on the precision of celestial cycles found itself at the mercy of an unpredictable climate. The political and spiritual authority of the Maya kings, who were believed to mediate with the gods for rain, evaporated along with the water. The social contract shattered. There was no single moment of collapse but a gradual, painful unraveling. People did not perish in the streets, they simply voted with their feet. They abandoned the magnificent stone cities, dispersing into smaller, more manageable villages in search of reliable water sources. The cultural zenith of the Maya was over, but the people endured, adapting their way of life to a new, harsher reality. Their story is a powerful lesson in a different kind of resilience, one defined not by rebuilding a centralized state, but by the flexibility to decentralize and return to a simpler, more sustainable existence. The Maya collapse forces us to ask, what does true resilience look like? Is it the ability to build higher walls and more complex systems, or is it the wisdom to know when to let go and move on? This new world echo of an old world pattern reveals a haunting truth that civilizations separated by vast distances and time can be felled by the same environmental pressures. And it makes the final fate of the Bronze Age world, a single moment where multiple cataclysms converged, all the more terrifying to behold. A single broken clay tablet, baked in the fire of a burning palace, captures the final moments of the Bronze Age. It is a desperate plea for grain sent from the city of Ugarit to its allies, a stark admission that the entire system was breaking down. This was not the fall of one empire, but the simultaneous collapse of an entire international world. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, the Eastern Mediterranean was a vibrant network of grand kingdoms, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians, and trading hubs like Ugarit, all linked by a complex web of diplomacy, gift exchange, and the shipment of vital goods like copper and tin. Then the dominoes began to fall. It started with the Earth itself, a series of powerful earthquakes, likely linked to a period of intense seismic activity, shattered city walls from Greece to Anatolia. These were not isolated incidents, but a rolling wave of geological unrest that crippled the physical infrastructure of these powerful states. As they were struggling to rebuild, a second shock hit, a climatic one. Tree ring and sediment data reveal a period of severe, prolonged drought that stretched across the region. Crops failed, famine spread, and the very tax base of these empires, which was agricultural surplus, evaporated. Desperate, hungry populations began to move. This is the likely origin of the mysterious Sea Peoples, a confederation of raiders and migrants who appear in Egyptian records as a terrifying, unstoppable force. They were not a single army, but a symptom of the wider collapse, displaced peoples from shattered homelands now swarming the coasts, attacking the weakened empires and severing the crucial sea lanes that held the entire system together. This is what historian Eric Klein calls a system's collapse. Each disaster, an earthquake, a drought, an invasion, was a shock the system might have survived on its own. But arriving in rapid succession, they created a cascade of failure. A king could not send troops to defend a distant province because he needed them to quell famine riots at home. A merchant fleet could not deliver tin for bronze weapons because the ports were in ruins or blockaded by pirates. The interconnectedness that had been the source of their wealth and power became their greatest vulnerability. The archaeological record at cities like Ugarit is a chaotic tapestry of this perfect storm. Excavations reveal layers of ash and collapsed buildings from earthquakes, mixed with the arrowheads and weaponry of invaders. It is impossible to separate the natural from the human disaster because they fed into each other. The collapse plunged the region into a dark age, a centuries-long period where literacy vanished, grand architecture ceased, and international trade ground to a halt. Grand palaces were abandoned and forgotten. Yet, from the ashes of these centralized, top-heavy empires, new opportunities arose. In the power vacuum left by the Hittites and Mycenaeans, smaller, more agile civilizations emerged. The Phoenicians, for instance, took to the sea not as raiders, but as the world's first great maritime merchants, establishing trade networks that would stretch across the Mediterranean. They perfected an alphabet that was far simpler than the complex syllabic scripts of the fallen empires, a technology that would eventually democratize writing. The collapse, for all its horror, cleared the ground for innovation. This ancient system's collapse holds up a dark mirror to our modern world. We too live in an age of profound interconnection, where a drought in one breadbasket region can spike global food prices, where a pandemic can halt international travel, and where a disruption in a single shipping lane can cause shortages on the other side of the world. Our buffers, while technologically advanced, may be just as fragile when faced with multiple, simultaneous shocks. The lesson of the Bronze Age is not that interconnection is bad, but that resilience depends on a system's ability to absorb a cascade of failures without completely unraveling. This raises a profound question about the legacy of such immense upheavals. If collapse can scatter a civilization, where do all those people and their ideas eventually go? A single broken pot tells a story not of its making, but of its journey. When a cataclysm struck, the most immediate human response was not to rebuild, but to leave. Entire communities, from early hunter-gatherers to settled farmers of the Bronze Age, gathered what they could carry and walked away from their homes. This was not a disorganized flight, but a calculated survival strategy, a mass migration that would redraw the human map. The mysterious sea peoples who terrorized the eastern Mediterranean were likely not a monolithic army, but a wave of such displaced populations. Pushed from their homelands by the same droughts and earthquakes that toppled empires, they became a force of nature themselves, moving across the sea in search of new land, their very movement applying the final, shattering pressure to an already crumbling world. These journeys were the engines of cultural diffusion. As people moved, they carried their most precious cargo not in their bags, but in their minds, their languages, their technologies, and their beliefs. One of the most profound examples is the spread of Indo-European languages. Today, languages from English to Hindi to Greek share a common ancestral tongue. Linguists and geneticists now believe this family tree spread from the Pontic Caspian steppe, a vast grassland north of the Black Sea. Around 5,000 years ago, climate shifts may have turned these pastures harsh, prompting the people living there to migrate outward in all directions. They took their language and their knowledge of wheeled vehicles and horses with them, seeding these innovations across Europe and Asia. The proof is written in our genes and scattered in the ground. DNA analysis of ancient skeletons reveals the movement of these steppe populations deep into Europe, while the sudden appearance of their distinct artifacts, like specific styles of pottery and horse gear, in new regions marks their path like a trail of breadcrumbs. The result of this chaotic mixing was rarely pure replacement. More often, it was a creative fusion. In the power vacuum left by the Bronze Age collapse, we see a blending of cultural traditions. Artistic motifs from Mesopotamia begin to appear in Egyptian art, and Mycenaean architectural ideas filter into the Levant. The old order had shattered, and from the fragments, something new and hybrid was being glued together. This ancient pattern of disaster-driven migration holds a stark mirror to our own time. When we see images of modern refugee crises, of people fleeing drought, famine, or conflict, we are witnessing the same fundamental human instinct for survival that once scattered the sea peoples. The scale is global, but the impulse is ancient. This constant churning movement of people forced by cataclysms was the hidden current that connected seemingly isolated civilizations, setting the stage for the next great force that would bind the ancient world together, the vast and vulnerable web of trade. A single ship failing to arrive could topple a kingdom. The Bronze Age world was bound together by a fragile web of trade routes, invisible threads stretching from the mines of Anatolia to the palaces of Mesopotamia and the ports of the Indus Valley. Copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia, and luxury goods like lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan moved along these routes, fueling economies and arming armies. This interconnectedness was a source of immense strength, but it also created a profound vulnerability. A cataclysm in one corner of the map could send shockwaves through the entire system. Imagine a massive volcanic eruption, like the one at Thera, spewing ash that not only buried nearby islands but also choked the sea lanes for years. The tin that traveled from Anatolia to be alloyed with copper, creating the essential bronze for tools and weapons, would simply stop coming. The result was not just a shortage of goods but a paralysis of state power. A king without bronze could not equip his army, leaving his borders undefended. Artisans who relied on imported materials found themselves without a trade. The economic collapse was swift and merciless, amplifying a local natural disaster into a regional crisis. Historians see this pattern clearly. A society might have weathered a local drought, but if that drought also struck the lands of its trading partners, the collapse was often inevitable. The system had no slack. This ancient dynamic reveals a crucial lesson about resilience. The trade networks that survived were not necessarily the largest, but those with built-in redundancies. Civilizations that relied on a single source for a critical resource, like tin from one specific region, were sitting ducks. Those who had cultivated diverse partners, or who had alternative materials or routes to fall back on, could absorb the shock and keep functioning. In the wake of such breakdowns, we often see a surge of localized innovation. When the tin trade collapsed, some societies turned to iron, a more common but harder to work metal, ultimately leading to a technological revolution. When long-distance trade vanished, communities had to become more self-sufficient, rediscovering local crafts and resources they had long forgotten. This raises a pressing question for our own world. Our modern global supply chains are the ultimate expression of those ancient trade routes, infinitely more complex but perhaps just as fragile. When a single container ship blocks a canal or a pandemic halts production in a key industrial region, the entire world feels the disruption. The lesson from the Bronze Age is not to abandon interconnection, but to consciously build buffers and diversify our sources, to create systems that can bend without breaking. This economic unraveling did more than just empty treasuries and disarm soldiers, however. It struck at the very core of what people believed about the world and their place within it, forcing a radical rethinking of divine order and human purpose. When the world crumbled, humanity turned to the gods. Ancient priests in Sumer, staring at the ruin left by a devastating flood, did not see random chance. They interpreted the deluge as divine wrath, a punishment from the heavens for some collective sin or failure. This belief forced a profound shift in human consciousness. It was no longer enough to simply rebuild the physical walls of a city. Now, societies had to rebuild their spiritual relationship with the cosmos, leading to the development of codified laws and elaborate public rituals designed to appease unpredictable deities. The very concept of order, of Mot in Egypt or Mi in Mesopotamia, emerged as a direct response to the ever-present threat of chaos from both nature and the divine. This was not just about religion, it was about survival. By creating a system of rules and offerings, people believed they could exert some small measure of control over forces that were otherwise beyond their comprehension. These cataclysms did not just create gods of wind and water, they forged entire worldviews centered on cycles of destruction and rebirth. In Hinduism, the concept of yugas describes vast eons of time, each ending in a dissolution before a new creation begins. Zoroastrianism framed existence as a cosmic struggle between the forces of light and darkness, a narrative that gave profound meaning to the very real suffering of drought and famine. These were not pessimistic philosophies. They were comforting, providing a framework that assured people that even the most terrifying events were part of a larger, meaningful pattern. The chaos of the Bronze Age collapse, which shattered the old certainties of palace and king, seems to have echoed into the emerging Greek mind. Pre-Socratic philosophers like Heraclitus pondered the nature of reality itself, concluding that change was the only constant. His famous statement that you cannot step into the same river twice is a philosophical reflection of a world that had experienced the ground shifting literally and figuratively. They looked at fire, water, and earth not as capricious gods, but as fundamental elements, trying to find a stable principle behind a seemingly unstable world. This intellectual adaptation shows that cataclysms spurred more than just new tools or governments. They forced deeper reflections on humanity's place in the cosmos. The need to find meaning in disaster is a thread that stretches from those ancient temples to our own time. How do our modern belief systems, whether religious or secular, address the looming environmental crises of today? We see similar patterns, with some interpreting climate change as a form of divine judgment and others seeking meaning in scientific calls for collective action and stewardship of the planet. This spiritual and philosophical journey through disaster inevitably leads to a very practical question. If we can find meaning in the rubble, what brilliant, tangible innovations can we actually build from it? Rubble became a blueprint for revolution. When the floodwaters receded in Mesopotamia, they left behind more than just mud and ruin. They presented a stark engineering problem. The old ways of simply rebuilding the same vulnerable village were no longer enough. This necessity, born from catastrophe, ignited a technological leap that would define civilization for millennia. Ancient engineers, standing on the banks of the swollen Euphrates, began to envision a new kind of landscape. They did not just see a river, they saw a system to be controlled. Their answer was the levee, a raised earthen wall to contain the river's rage, and the canal, a man-made channel to divert its life-giving water to fields far from the dangerous banks. This was not a small-scale project. It required the coordinated labor of thousands, a massive communal effort that transformed human society's relationship with nature. For the first time, people were not just reacting to their environment, they were actively reshaping it to ensure their survival. This same pattern of crisis-driven invention repeated itself across the ancient world. When earthquakes repeatedly shook the Minone palaces on Crete, their architects did not simply build the same fragile structures. They incorporated clever shock-absorbing techniques, using wooden beams to create flexible frames within their stone walls, allowing the buildings to sway and settle rather than shatter. This was architectural resilience, literally built into the foundations of their culture. Similarly, the collapse of long-distance trade routes during the Bronze Age disruptions created a desperate shortage of tin, the essential component for bronze. This scarcity forced metalworkers to experiment with a more common but notoriously difficult material, iron. The process of smelting iron required much higher temperatures and new furnace designs, a technological hurdle that was only overcome out of sheer necessity. The resulting iron revolution was profound, creating tools that were harder and more durable than bronze, ultimately making metal implements more accessible and transforming agriculture and warfare. Even a simple device could represent a monumental shift. During periods of punishing drought in Egypt, when the Nile's flood failed, the shaduf emerged. This counter-weighted bucket on a pole was a masterpiece of leverage, allowing a single farmer to lift water from the river and pour it into irrigation channels with minimal effort. It was a humble invention, but it dramatically increased the efficiency of water use, turning marginal land into productive fields and giving society a crucial buffer against famine. The archaeological record is filled with these testaments to adaptive creativity. The first heavy plows, capable of turning the tough soils of northern Europe, appear after climate shifts opened new lands for farming. The sudden proliferation of fortified walls around cities speaks to a world learning to defend itself against the chaos that followed environmental disaster. Each of these innovations represented a fundamental shift in human agency. People were no longer passive victims of cosmic forces. They were becoming problem solvers, using observation, ingenuity, and collective will to bend the world to their needs. How does this ancient pattern reflect in our own era? Today, the crisis of climate change is driving a surge in renewable energy technology, from advanced solar panels to more efficient battery storage. The threat of global pandemics has accelerated the development of mRNA vaccine platforms at an unprecedented speed. Just like the ancient engineers who looked at a flooded plain and saw a future of irrigated fields, we are forced by circumstance to innovate our way toward survival. This relentless drive to invent, however, did more than just change the tools people used. It fundamentally reshaped the very structure of their societies, redefining who held power and why. A king's power evaporated when his granaries lay empty and his palace walls crumbled into dust. In the chaotic aftermath of the late Bronze Age collapse, the rigid hierarchy of Mycenaean Greece simply dissolved. The Wanax, the all-powerful king who controlled a centralized economy of pottery, olive oil, and textiles from his fortified palace, suddenly had nothing to distribute. The system of scribes recording every transaction on clay tablets vanished, and with it, the king's divine right to rule. What emerged from this rubble was something profoundly different: the Greek Dark Age. This period was not dark because of ignorance, but because the grand, centralized sources of light had gone out. In their place, countless smaller fires were lit. Society became more localized, more rural, and strikingly more egalitarian. Power shifted from a single palace to numerous village chieftains, and the common farmer gained a new level of independence. The Cataclysm had, in effect, reset the social contract, dismantling an entrenched elite and creating space for a broader distribution of power. This dynamic played out differently across the ancient world, revealing that disaster is a powerful but unpredictable sculptor of society. In Mesopotamia, where unpredictable floods were seen as the wrath of unpredictable gods, the priestly class often saw its authority grow. They were the intermediaries, the ones who could read the omens and perform the rituals to appease the divine anger behind the rising waters. A successful prediction or the claim of one reinforced their power, tying social order to their perceived control over nature. Conversely, in the Indus Valley, the slow, inexorable shifting of rivers worked to decentralize power. Without a single, reliable water source to control, no centralized authority could maintain its grip. The response to that creeping disaster was not to empower a new king, but to disperse into smaller, self-sufficient communities, flattening the social hierarchy in the process. The ultimate impact on social structures came down to a simple, brutal question of legitimacy. When elites failed in their most basic duty to protect and provide for their people, their authority evaporated. But when a new leader could organize a response, guide a migration, or innovate a survival strategy, they could rise from the chaos to forge a new social order. This ancient pattern forces a difficult reflection on our own time. Do modern disasters, from hurricanes to pandemics, challenge entrenched power, or do they more often provide an opportunity for that power to consolidate further? The answer is rarely simple, revealing that a society's true resilience may be measured not just by its walls, but by its capacity for equitable change in the face of overwhelming force. This profound reshaping of the social landscape inevitably influenced the most intimate of human relationships, redefining the roles that men and women would play in a world remade by cataclysm. A shattered clay figurine of a woman found crushed beneath the stones of an Anatolian home might not depict a goddess but a community leader. In the chaotic days following a devastating earthquake, traditional roles could fracture as easily as city walls. With men often away at war or lost in the initial collapse, the work of recovery fell heavily on those who remained. Archaeological finds from these sites suggest women stepped into crucial roles as healers, using their knowledge of medicinal herbs to tend to the wounded, and as organizers, managing the distribution of scarce food and water among survivors. Their influence in this domestic sphere, the very heart of the crisis, likely expanded, granting them a temporary but vital authority. This pattern of disruption is echoed in fragments of Hittite texts that hint at women overseeing communal granaries during famines, a responsibility that would have been unthinkable in ordinary times. The evidence is sparse, filtered through the deep-seated patriarchal biases of the historical record, but the subtle clues are compelling. In Egypt, during the famines that ended the Old Kingdom, the formal, state-controlled agricultural system collapsed. It was then that women's deep, generational knowledge of wild, edible plants and their locations would have become a matter of life and death. This specialized understanding, often passed from mother to daughter, could have temporarily elevated their status within the family and the community, as their foraging skills meant the difference between starvation and survival. Yet the aftermath of a cataclysm was not a straightforward path toward liberation. The same forces that created openings for women could also trigger a desperate retreat into rigid tradition. The law code of Ur-Nammu from Mesopotamia, created in the wake of societal upheaval, explicitly sought to control women's behavior, regulating their movements and reinforcing their legal and economic dependence on men. In times of profound fear, when the cosmic order seemed broken, reasserting control over the household and its women was one way a shaken patriarchy tried to rebuild a sense of stability. This push and pull reveals a profound truth about disaster. It does not create new social dynamics so much as it intensifies existing ones, for better or for worse. The precarious status of women in these ancient recoveries forces us to look at our own world with new eyes. How do modern gender dynamics, from the division of domestic labor to the leadership in emergency response, continue to shape a community's resilience when the ground gives way? The stories of these women, however faint their echo, were not written on clay tablets for kings. They were carried in the memories of their families, passed down through generations in the quiet, enduring language of story. The stories told by the elders around a fire were more than just entertainment. They were a vital technology for survival. Before the invention of writing, oral traditions functioned as living archives, meticulously preserving the memory of earth-shattering events for countless generations. In ancient India, a storyteller might recite the legend of a great flood sent by the gods, a narrative that modern geologists have found aligns with evidence of massive inundations in the region thousands of years earlier. Similarly, Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories describe coastlines that were flooded as sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, chronicling geographic changes that science has since confirmed. These are not mere coincidences. These narratives were designed to be unforgettable, using rhythm, melody, and repetition to encode crucial information into the collective memory of a people. They were the original disaster preparedness guides passed from parent to child as a sacred duty. Anthropologists now understand that these oral histories are not primitive myths, but often highly reliable accounts. When a Pacific Islander legend describes the fiery explosion of a volcano with stunning detail, and archaeologists can date that eruption to the same era through layers of ash, the line between story and history blurs. These traditions contain kernels of truth, factual seeds wrapped in the powerful language of cultural meaning. They highlight how human memory brilliantly adapts to encode survival strategies, turning a past catastrophe into a lesson for the future. This raises a profound question for our modern, data-driven world. How can we better integrate this deep, place-based indigenous knowledge into our own disaster preparedness plans? The memories held by oral cultures represent a vast, untapped library of environmental observation, offering insights that our own short written records might easily miss. This powerful appreciation for non-written sources forces us to confront the inherent limitations of our primary window into the past, the silent and often ambiguous evidence dug from the ground. A single layer of ash in an ancient city tells a story, but its true meaning is often a riddle. An archaeologist carefully brushing it away must ask, was this left by a volcanic eruption hundreds of miles away, or by the burning of the city itself? The evidence for these earth-shattering events is rarely straightforward. It is fragmentary, ambiguous, and open to passionate debate. The story of the so-called Sea Peoples is a perfect example of this challenge. For over a century, historians pointed to Egyptian temple reliefs, showing these mysterious warriors as proof of a massive invasion that toppled empires. But was it really that simple? Newer interpretations suggest these Sea Peoples were not a unified army, but a symptom of the wider collapse. Displaced populations pushed from their homelands by the very droughts and earthquakes that were weakening the great powers. The invaders might have been refugees, their violent arrival the final spark in a tinderbox already primed by environmental catastrophe. This shift in thinking highlights a crucial problem: our evidence is often biased. The Egyptian records show their military victory, but they do not record the desperate circumstances that forced these people to migrate in the first place. The victor gets to write the history while the complex underlying causes of the loser remain silent. The physical evidence itself is constantly under threat. Natural decay erodes organic materials. Looters tear apart sites for treasure, scattering crucial context to the winds, and later settlers often built directly on top of ruins, mixing the layers of time into an incomprehensible jumble. This is why experts today caution so strongly against monocausal explanations. The fall of a civilization is never just an invasion, or just a drought, or just an earthquake. It is a cascade of failures, a perfect storm where political weakness, economic fragility, and environmental shock collide. To untangle this web, we must rely on an interdisciplinary approach where the climatologist's ice core data, the geologist's soil analysis, and the historian's translated texts all come together to form a single, more complete picture. This requires a certain humility, an acceptance that our understanding is always a work in progress, a best guess based on the puzzle pieces we have managed to recover. It forces us to ask what crucial pieces of the puzzle are still missing, buried deep underground or vanished entirely. This critical perspective, this awareness of the limits of our knowledge, is what ultimately prepares us to look at our own world and draw meaningful, sobering lessons from the silent stones of the past. The wisdom of forgotten ruins can guide the design of our future cities. Modern urban planners facing the threat of rising seas and extreme weather are now looking back, not forward, for solutions. They study the intricate irrigation canals of ancient Mesopotamia, marveling at how early societies managed unpredictable water supplies. This is not mere historical curiosity. It is a vital blueprint for building climate-resilient communities today. The cataclysms that shattered early civilizations offer a stark lesson in the consequences of overexploitation. The Maya, for instance, did not know they were sealing their own fate by clearing vast forests for agriculture. This deforestation altered local rainfall patterns, turning their world to dust. Their collapse is a powerful warning against pushing an ecosystem beyond its breaking point. In contrast, Egypt's long success demonstrates the profound benefits of working in harmony with natural cycles. By carefully observing and adapting to the Nile's annual flood, rather than fighting it, they built a society that endured for millennia. These ancient histories point to a common thread. True resilience is rarely found in rigid, monolithic systems. It emerges from diversity, the kind that allows for multiple food sources and trade partners. It depends on flexibility, the ability to abandon a failing city or adopt a new technology, and it is rooted in community cohesion, the shared purpose that mobilizes people to build a levee or share dwindling resources. The critical question for our time is how to translate this ancient wisdom into modern policy. How can we incentivize agricultural diversity to prevent a single crop failure from triggering famine? How can urban design incorporate natural floodplains instead of just pouring more concrete? The answers require looking at our own interconnected world with the same clear-eyed realism that the ancients applied to theirs. Their struggles illuminate our own vulnerabilities, making the preservation of the places where they lived and died more urgent than ever. The very archaeological sites that hold these lessons are now under threat from the same forces of climate change and development, risking the loss of this crucial knowledge before we have fully learned from it. The very sites that hold the answers are now vanishing before our eyes. Along coastlines from the Mediterranean to Southeast Asia, ancient ruins are being slowly eaten away by the rising seas they once survived, a modern cataclysm undoing the work of ancient ones. The same waters that swallowed Doggerland and transformed shorelines millennia ago are now lapping at the foundations of Phoenician ports and early human settlements, dissolving millennia of history into the surf. But the sea is not the only threat. Rampant urban development paves over tells, those ancient mounds that mark the graves of cities, while political instability and looting strip sites of their artifacts and, more importantly, their context. In Iraq, the cradle of civilization, looters' pits pockmark the landscape around ancient Sumerian cities, creating a heartbreaking scene of shattered pottery and scattered bones where a single, intact layer could have told a complete story of resilience or collapse. These are not just stones being lost, they are entire chapters of the human manual for survival. Organizations like the World Heritage Center work to shield these places, inscribing them on lists and rallying international support. But the task is monumental, a race against time, tide, and human greed. This is where technology becomes our greatest ally. Archaeologists are now using drones to create high-resolution, three-dimensional maps of entire sites in days, a process that once took years. Satellite imagery monitors vulnerable locations for signs of looting or encroachment from space, and laser scanners can capture the precise dimensions of a crumbling wall or an intricate inscription, creating a perfect digital twin that will survive long after the original stone has eroded to dust. These digital archives are more than just backups, they are new ways of seeing, allowing researchers to virtually reconstruct a city and understand how its layout helped it withstand a flood or contributed to its fall during a drought. But technology alone is not enough. It requires a global constituency of care. How can we, as a global public, become part of this preservation? It begins with awareness, with understanding that a looted vase or a submerged temple wall is not just a lost artifact, but a lost data point in humanity's long struggle with a changing planet. Supporting responsible tourism, engaging with digital reconstructions online, and advocating for cultural preservation funding are all ways to contribute. This urgent work to safeguard our collective past inevitably leads us to a deeper ethical dilemma. In unearthing these stories of disaster, whose trauma are we handling, and what responsibility do we have to the descendants of those who survived? A single unearthed skull carries the weight of an entire society's final moments. As we uncover these stories of ancient disaster, we are not just handling artifacts, but the profound legacy of human suffering and survival. This work forces a difficult ethical question upon modern researchers. How do we share these narratives responsibly without causing panic or having them twisted for political agendas? The very language used to describe a civilization's end matters immensely. To say the Maya collapsed because of environmental mismanagement, for instance, risks simplifying a complex reality and implicitly blaming the victims for their own demise. It ignores their agency, their attempts to adapt, and the immense external pressures they faced, a more ethical approach championed by thinkers like ethicist Dr. Jody Joy frames the story around the people's resilience and the difficult choices they made in the face of forces beyond their control. This shift in perspective transforms a tale of failure into a lesson in human endurance. The ethical challenges extend to the physical sites themselves. Many of these places, from sacred mounds to ancestral burial grounds, remain deeply significant to descendant communities. When archaeologists arrive with shovels and permits, they are not just digging into dirt, they are interacting with living cultural heritage. The old model of extraction, where artifacts were removed to distant museums for study, is increasingly seen as a form of academic colonialism. The emerging standard is one of collaboration, where local communities and indigenous groups are partners from the very beginning. They help shape the research questions, guide the interpretation of findings, and decide the fate of the objects and human remains that are uncovered. This collaborative process ensures that the knowledge gained fosters empathy and connection, rather than exploitation. It recognizes that the people whose ancestors lived through these cataclysms have a vital stake in how their stories are told. The ultimate goal is to ensure this powerful history does not become a weapon. Narratives of collapse can be dangerously misappropriated to justify modern prejudices or to argue that certain societies are inherently doomed, a deterministic view that most scholars firmly reject. The real value of this knowledge lies in its ability to highlight our shared human vulnerability and our collective capacity for adaptation. These ancient struggles are not just about them, they are about us. How will our own society's story be told centuries from now, and what role will we play in shaping its final chapters? These threads of fire, water, and earth were woven into a single, defining tapestry of human history. The great floods of Mesopotamia did not just destroy villages, they forged the very concept of the state. The vanishing rivers of the Indus Valley did not merely empty cities, they taught the difficult lesson of decentralized survival. The volcanic ash that buried Minone frescoes also scattered their artists and ideas, seeding new cultures far from home. Each cataclysm, in its own brutal way, was a crucible. It presented an impossible problem that demanded an ingenious solution, forcing leaps in engineering, governance, and social organization that would have been unimaginable in times of quiet comfort. This perspective completely reshapes history's trajectory. We can no longer see the past as a steady, linear climb toward greater complexity. Instead, it reveals a rhythm of crisis and response, a punctuated equilibrium where long periods of stability are shattered by brief, violent episodes of creative destruction. The real story of human progress is not one of kings and conquests alone, but of communities staring into the abyss and deciding to build something new from the rubble. This forces a profound question about our own era. We live in a time of unprecedented global interconnection, a system that mirrors the vulnerable trade networks of the Bronze Age but on a planetary scale. Our environmental challenges, from rising seas to shifting climate patterns, echo the very pressures that toppled mighty empires. If these ancient cataclysms were the forge in which human resilience was tempered, what kind of society is being shaped in the fires of our own time? The patterns of collapse and renewal are not locked in the distant past. They are a living legacy, and we are now the weavers adding our own thread to this immense, unfinished tapestry. These echoes of fire and flood are not just remnants of a distant past. They are the very foundations upon which our present was built. Each deluge that forged a bureaucracy in Mesopotamia, each drought that scattered the people of the Indus Valley, and each tremor that toppled a citadel in Anatolia was a brutal but effective teacher. Humanity did not merely endure these trials, we learned from them. We learned to read the rivers and the skies, to build with flexibility, and to find strength in community when the old orders crumbled. This enduring capacity to innovate and persevere in the face of chaos is our shared inheritance. It is a story that challenges us to look beyond the surface of history, to see the hidden struggles that sculpted our world. These ancient whispers offer profound guidance for our own uncertain future, reminding us that resilience is not about avoiding shocks, but about learning how to bend and adapt. As we face our own planetary shifts, let these stories inspire you to look deeper. What forgotten cataclysm from history fascinates you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to continue uncovering the hidden lessons buried in time, subscribe and join me on the next exploration into the forces that truly shaped our world.